So welcome everyone, and a quick note that we are recording and the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to pay my respects to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land in which the Callaghan campus resides and where those of us who are in the room are located today. Our speaker today, Dr. Tanika Koosmen, is a casual academic in ancient history at the University of Newcastle. Her doctoral research focused on the development of the man-to-wolf metamorphic tradition in the Greco-Roman corpus and its impact on modern werewolf fiction through historical examples of post-humanist philosophy and critical theory. Her research interests include the reception of folkloric creatures through a variety of cultural contexts and the interpretation of post-humanist figures in ancient mythic forms. She was recipient of the Odyssey Travel Scholarship, allowing her to travel to Greece in July 2022. And her paper today is a critical reflection on that experience and is titled Athens, Olympia, Delphi, Visiting Sites of Significance in Greece 2022. Over to you, Tanika.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along and giving me a platform to rant a little bit about the benefits of providing Australian students with the opportunity to travel and immerse themselves in very different cultures that comprise the foundations of their academic interests. I do want to offer a little bit of an apology in advance. I had every intention of being very strictly analytic about this experience and sort of talking about the value that I gained, the research advantage and all of those fun things. But I went through a lot of photos to put together this PowerPoint and it ended up being a very emotional experience. I had a lot of emotional responses to the stuff as I relived this fantastic, incredible experience that I had. My personal background in particular makes me feel quite strongly about this subject. During my PhD, right before the pandemic hit and everything changed for everyone, I was working 4 casual jobs and still completing study at full-time capacity. So the opportunity to travel to Greece and to sort of see that legacy of the ancient culture wasn't going to come by unless I had the support of a scholarship like this. I do want to make a quick note here. This seminar paper does give a very short summary of some potentially triggering material, a mythical story involving sexual assault in particular. It's a very short sentence summary and it occurs on the slide entitled Acropolis Museum. So I just want to put that out there, that it could be potentially troublesome to anyone who is triggered by this material in particular. Okay. I was hoping that would work if I just hit the button, but apparently not. Here we go. Okay, bit of background to set us up today. In late 2019, a new scholarship opportunity arose targeted at classics and ancient history postgraduate students for the purpose of funding travel to an area of ancient significance. This was designed to provide an occasion to very much experience those sites of importance to the ancient culture that formed a large part of the thesis project. I was incredibly grateful to have been chosen as the first recipient and given the chance to experience that ancient culture that I had studied for some 7 years beforehand. And nearly immediately after the award of the scholarship in early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic halted all international travel. And when the world opened up again, the scholarship donors and the university were both kind enough to offer me the opportunity to travel regardless of the lessened impact that it would have on my thesis. Although my understanding of a very core tenet that I had held in my research up until that point was quite radically altered as a result of my experiences there. Of course, the universe didn't quite let me off that easily, and it turned out that my original travel plans were no longer viable. My original scholarship application had me visiting a very specific place, the current excavation project that is working on the Mount Lycaon Sanctuary, which is run through the University of Arizona and the Penn State Museum in the US. This project in particular is focused on the ash altar that housed a cult to Zeus, one that worshipped him as Zeus Lycaeus, or Wolf Zeus as it were, and their cult practices were shrouded in a very specific kind of mystery. Mythic material on the cult itself suggested that ritual human sacrifice was a very common occurrence. In fact, it is one of the most corroborated examples of the practice in any ancient Greek culture. And although archaeological evidence has not supported the extent to which the ancient authors had claimed that sacrifices were occurring, there were human remains discovered at the site in 2011. These remains were of a teenage boy buried beside the altar, and although there are no clear signs that the boy was ritually sacrificed, it is a very odd place to bury a single human body. The relevance of the cult to my research was its initiation rites, and this is what I wrote about in my thesis, which some ancient sources claim saw a youth, usually a young boy, chosen by lot, who's transformed into a wolf and sent to live in the forest as an animal for 9 years. And although the site would have added a new angle to my research, when I was in the process of replanning this particular trip, I couldn't get into contact with any of the academics, and the website that the excavation is up on is not currently working. And I checked last night, it is still not working, which is very, very upsetting. Nevertheless, one of my aims in particular for this trip was to see the extent to which animal imagery forged a very important aspect of the artifacts of ancient Greek culture. And I was lucky enough to be given the chance to see not just the artifacts at 3 very significant sites, Athens, Olympia, and Delphi, but also the way that ancient culture still lives alongside modern Greece. As a student that was so far removed from the culture of either ancient or modern Greco-Roman material that I cultivated an interest for, this gave me such a better understanding of how my research can evolve to become relevant in new contexts. A bit of a rundown of some of the places that I visited. I do have a couple on here and they are up on the slide there as well. And I did have quite a few epiphanies in random Greek museums and on the side of the street in Athens when it comes to my research, which is a very interesting way to experience either of those things. So I took a tour of the ancient sites in a group setting and got the chance to see how ancient material of Greece is packaged for contemporary tourists as well. So I began in Athens through Mycenae, Olympia, and Delphi. And then I spent some time, about a week, staying close to the city centre of Athens in order to gain an experience of how ancient culture was embedded in a very domestic setting. My travels began with what is probably one of the most popular sites of ancient Greece, and I will play this while I speak. They were supposed to play automatically, but apparently they don't. That's okay. So I first went off to the Acropolis of Athens. This site hosts the Parthenon, the Herodian, and the Erechtheion. The first monument we saw is the Herodian Theatre, as you can see in that little video on the slide there, built by Herodes Atticus in 161 CE. And the guide told us the story of the man who had built this theatre for the love and memory of his wife. I was lucky enough to return to this theatre later on in my trip and to see it used exactly as it was intended to be used. On the slide here, a lovely photo. I saw a production of Tosca, an Italian opera that tells the story of a young woman who is in love with a Roman artist, but is desired and courted by a very violent and brutal general of Napoleon. The experience of sitting in the theatre in 40-degree heat, on stone benches with flimsy pillows and an absolute sea of handheld fans snapping out every single time the wind died down, and hearing these voices echo through the theatre, it was absolutely an incredible moment to experience this embedded history in a way that I would not have got the experience or have not got the opportunity otherwise. So to return to the Acropolis, here we go. Okay, so with any moderately famous site, visiting of the thing itself is always a little bit chaotic. As you can see in the video and the photo there, the walk up to the Parthenon, there are tourists packed in, trying so hard to get their photos of every single angle. Tour guides shouting at people who kept blocking the pathway and causing a bit of a traffic jam, but very much, fortunately for me, a chance to actually exist in the same space as these monuments that had formed such a significant part of my research absolutely made it impossible to dampen any enthusiasm I had about the seeing of the thing itself. I took about 15 photos on the walk up to the Parthenon, and I think twice that of the Parthenon and Erechtheion once I was close enough to actually see them. So as a cultural historian who specializes in the mythic literature of ancient Greece and Rome, it was so incredibly interesting to hear so many different tour guides telling the story of Poseidon and Athena and the contest for the patronage of Athens. where Poseidon offers the first king of Athens a spring, and it turns out to be a spring of salt water, so no good to his people. And Athena offers the olive tree, which becomes this symbolic representation of Athens itself. And this was a cultural touchstone for many of the people who had travelled here to see this site of significance. And I could hear people talking about the different versions of the myth that they had heard or read before. In more contemporary contexts, we were told the story of the very heavy damage suffered by the Parthenon during the Great Turkish War in 1687, the flying of the Nazi flag over the Parthenon in the Second World War, and the restoration project that is attempting to maintain the monument. In this particular project, and you can see the scaffolding on that picture there that sort of rises all the way above the monument. It began in 1975, and it remains a keystone in the conservation of ancient Greek monuments. This is very important stuff to Greek culture even now. Walking around the structure and standing before it, and I took that second photo, that's a panoramic photo because I couldn't get the entire monument in one single photo without it. When you see it rise above you on one side and almost the entirety of Athens sprawled out behind you on the other side, it evokes a very specific sense of awe that I am very grateful and very lucky to have experienced. So the Erechtheion, which stands a bit closer to the edge of the platform there and a bit further away from where you can sort of approach, a temple dedicated to Athena. The statues that stand as pillars are of 6 different women, all with unique characteristics. Later on, when we viewed the original 5 that stand in the Acropolis Museum, I could very much feel the undercurrent of sadness and rage that comes with the knowledge that so many of these monuments had been taken from their origins and placed in museums under this very false narrative of conservation and entertainment. And in this case, that final figure, which is not at the Acropolis Museum, is currently being held by the British. I can honestly say that displaying these artefacts anywhere other than firmly within their cultural origins does detract from their meaning. Comparatively, I spent time at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles in 2019, and that contains a very extensive private collection of ancient Greek and Latin artefacts. And there was a sense of lost context that I had found impacted this historical reception of the material. My visit to the Acropolis Museum absolutely reinforced this approach. So the artefacts are organised in a chronology in the Acropolis Museum, and it sort of allows you to move through historical eras as you follow the pathway of the museum. The first floor, of which you're actually only allowed to photograph half of the monuments, has this most beautiful and wonderful tribute to Athena, all of these artefacts relating to Athena herself. And her image is quite a constant throughout the museum, as it should be, as a museum in Athens. I was very lucky to have been able to view the 3 artefacts in particular on the slide here, which represented areas of research that I had undertaken in the past. The head of Artemis Boronia, which is the giant cult statue that stood in her sanctuary on the Acropolis from around 330 BCE. And the small bear, bear carving, which is her sacred animal as well. It's actually missing its face, which is why I only took a photo of the back. And the third one, I wrote on the rituals of the cult of Artemis in particular, where young girls would dress in bear skins and dance in these slow dragging movements to mimic the movements of the bear itself. It was quite a joyful and happy initiation rite for this particular avenue of worship. So the final statue on the slide here is Procne and Itis from the mythic cycle of Tereus, Procne, and Philomela. Procne holds the body of her son. You can sort of see, trying to show you here, the remains of the body of her son here. She has an arm that's extended over his neck. And she prepares to cut his throat in order to serve him as a meal to her husband, as Tereus, as punishment for the rape and mutilation of her sister Philomela. My work on Ovid's Metamorphoses is the first time I read this particularly horrifying myth, and to see the statue in front of me was quite an intense experience. In the days following my trip to the Acropolis of Athens, I had the opportunity to visit several very important archaeological sites, and one of which was being actively excavated while I was there. I think some of the other tour members might have been a little bit surprised to see me jumping up and down at people in a field very far away, but I was very excited. So first we traveled to Mycenae, where I visited the treasury of Atreus, a beehive-shaped tomb built into the ground, which dates from around 1250 BCE. The tour guide explained that the historic use of the tomb stretched all the way from Homeric times, Atreus being the notable father of Agamemnon and Menelaus, through to contemporary conflicts. And I found this really is the case with a lot of historical monuments, is they have this really distinct value in later historical eras that I hadn't anticipated, purely because my research hadn't spanned past antiquity in particular. So there are many carvings on the wall of the tomb that indicated use of the structure as a shelter. The ash that had collected on the inside in the main area, you can sort of see parts of it from behind the entryway there. So it indicated that there were people living, burning fires and using this place as a shelter for a really long time. There is nothing quite like feeling as small as you do when you're standing inside of a structure like this, which reaches 13.5 meters tall on the inside, which is quite an experience. It also echoes quite intensely in there. I also visited the Mycenae Museum, where there were animal and anthropomorphic sculptures that very much spoke to that blending of human and animal in a way that I had not anticipated. Unfortunately, my time there was not quite as extensive. We had quite a few things to do that day, so I didn't have as much time as I wanted to. But we did have the most fantastic experience heading on over to a studio where ancient techniques of pottery making and bronze and silver work were being taught to new students. These teachers were re-engaging with historical traditions of creation, and their studio offered tours, so we could see a few examples of their creation, which you can see a couple of on this particular stand here. Now, the one that I do want to mention, this is really cool. We got to see the students attempt at a Pythagorean cup, which, if it is filled past a certain point, there is a central column that siphons off the entire contents of the cup. And it's supposed to be designed as a prank to teach about greed. Don't fill your cup more than is necessary. The most beautiful part of this particular experience was this statue that you can see there. This gorgeous recreation of what I can only assume is 3 nymphs, muses, something along those lines, clustered together. And I know the glare on the photo is awful. I took, I think, about 6 photos just of this statue, and none of them came through very well at all. But that modern recreation had me in absolute awe to see it actively presented as craft and creation that was happening right now. I also bought this teeny tiny little, no one can probably see it, but I am wearing it today, my little Medusa pendant while we were there. And Medusa is a symbol of protection and has been since antiquity. So it's fantastic to see it still used in that same method. So one of the highlights of my trip absolutely was the archaeological site at ancient Olympia, where they were doing the digs, and I did surprise a few people by getting super excited about the people under the tent all the way over there. So this is a massive complex. I'll press the button for the video. Here we go. Please work. Here we go. It holds the ruins of several important temples and the housing and training structures involved in the earliest Olympic Games. It is also the place where the modern Olympic Games are started, and you can see a couple of examples of that particular ritual on YouTube, which is just really cool. So the place functions as a sister site to the dig at Mount Lycaon. Both are sites of worship of Zeus. Both are very active in early Greek history. And although the site at Mount Lycaon was in use centuries before Olympia as a place of worship for Zeus, there's similar finds, there's similar ritual structures. So my discoveries at Olympia could be applied to Mount Lycaon and gave me that new avenue of research that meant I wasn't really walking away with no understanding of how these rituals were being performed. So there are a lot of parallel findings that we can find at both of these sites. And I sort of started thinking about that animal-human or human-animal binary that formed that main contention of my thesis while I was walking around these grounds and walking through this museum. The artefacts that are discovered through the years of archaeological history at this site very much hold immense value to broader religious structures without tying them too closely to the worship that is unique at Olympia. And as a site of worship for Zeus in particular, this sort of widespread image of religious practice does make sense. There are a number of very famous monuments or remembrance of monuments, as the case may be, including the statue of Zeus, of which I've included a artistic representation. The statue itself was considered one of the marvels of the ancient world, sitting very, very tall, and is now lost to us thanks to the fact that quite a lot of it was taken and reused in different scenarios, in military scenarios certainly. It was used for parts or sold off. I don't know if you can tell from the artistic rendition, but it was ivory and gold, which certainly makes sense in terms of why it was taken to pieces. There was also the famous Nike statue, which you can sort of see her in that rendition here. She stood at a few different places, but there was that Nike who sits on the hand of Zeus, which is in pieces currently, but is being held up by those conservation efforts. So a lot of the statues and stuff that I saw that hadn't really survived to the contemporary era have this metal framework embedded within them in order to hold them in the position that they originally stood in. And in particular, the one that I saw, maybe that made me feel very small, was this. So this is the west pediment of the Temple of Zeus, the battle of Lapiths and centaurs. The statues were so large that it was impossible to get them all in focus in one photo. I tried a panoramic photo and I couldn't get them all in. And hopefully you can see down the bottom there that drawing that was provided by the museum to sort of show you how that original structure stood. And this Temple of Zeus is the main structure of Olympia in particular. So I can't actually tell you how small it makes you feel to stand in front of these figures. And all of a sudden these notions, these ancient notions and contemporary receptions of gods that are giant in form and look down on humanity as these tiny little humans, it makes a lot of sense when you are standing in front of marble sculptures like these. So there was this animalistic edge to a lot of artifacts that I kept being surprised every single time I saw. There is a sheer wealth of animal imagery across this whole museum. Really shouldn't surprise me, but it does every time. This statue in particular is the Roman Emperor Hadrian. The statue originates from around 117 to 138 CE. On his armor, which is carved here, there is a carving of, you can sort of see, the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, rather. And this iconography is a really important part of Roman history in particular. So the connection to the foundation of Rome itself holds this ongoing influence that gives validity to the power of Roman emperors all the way through to the fall of empire. And I'd always viewed this particular symbology, this Roman Romulus and Remus connection, as antithetical to the integration of the werewolf into Latin contexts. To view someone as a werewolf is to look down on them, is to see them as lesser, as more violent, as essentially just a bad person, which is something that does come up in the ancient sources quite a lot. And given this connection between wolves and the establishment of the Great Rome, surely the werewolf myth meant different things to the Romans that had passed the stories on. What I very much failed to account for was the view of the wolf beyond the binary image that I myself had inherited from the in-between periods of philosophy and critical theory. Even if these sites were where the human-animal distinction were first effected, the animal retains a completely different value to the ancient culture that adopted wolves as their mythical ancestry. And to see that value of that myth written into reality in the statue of one of the greatest Roman emperors, it is really an incredible thing to stand before. There was also a very distinct aspect to worship at Olympia that was very intrinsic to the manner in which worship was affected. The very amount, I was about to say small amount, it's very much not a small amount. the amount of small clay and metal animal votive offerings in the shape of bulls, cows, and horses is absolutely overwhelming. Around 4,500 of these figures have been found at Olympia alone, which is more than any other site in Greece. It was originally believed that these figurines represented the sacrificial rites in antiquity in particular. So you see the mound there. On the top of that mound, on the fourth day of the Olympic Games in antiquity, 100 oxen were sacrificed and burnt. Their thighs in particular were burnt right at the top of that mound there. But as it turns out, the animal figurines predate any worship of Zeus at this particular site and go all the way back to the geometric period. The very interesting aspect of these animal figurines is that scholars have actually been able to figure out that the figurines don't represent domestic animal stock. Rather, these are feral cows and bulls and horses, and not even wild cows and bulls and horses. These are, in fact, once domesticated, now escaped and breeding stock in the wild. And the importance of these figurines at an eventual site of worship for Zeus showed me a very distinct balance between domestication and wildness, one that not just carried into my research and helped me define my approach to the werewolf beyond this typical man into beast binary iteration, but one of diversity. And it eventually led me to the concept outlined in the very title of my thesis, Between the City and the Forest, as the feral animals had lived between their domesticated history and their wild origins. So the next archaeological site that I visited was at ancient Delphi. And the site here invoked a very emotional response from me, one that I hadn't expected at all, because the site itself is absolutely an embedded experience. So you travel up the main structures, and while you walk, there's this view from the pathway that directs your attention between the mountains right through the mouth of the valley. You can see really far distances, as I've attempted to capture on camera there. And I was very fortunate to have visited early in the morning and to see the fog settle and disperse through this particular valley. It is absolutely a singular location to experience. I can't recommend it enough. It gave me an understanding of the actual mythic value of the site itself. It was very clear to me that there was a sense of divinity in the location, not just in the buildings and temples that had been erected by the ancient cultures. The guide actually played us a very short example of music that had been recorded and inscribed on the walls of the temple as we walked up, as we climbed through those ruins. And the view from the foot of the theatre, which is around about where I have filmed from here, is honestly impressive. It's still the background on my phone every so often, so I can remember the feeling of standing right on top, right before the theatre at the site dedicated to Apollo. And at the peak of the site, standing beneath the shade of the tree, that you can sort of see out of the corner there, our guide told us a story that I will paraphrase for you here because it still affects me to this day. So at their core, the stories that are told about the oracle at Delphi are about choice and responsibility, which for us is based in Socratic philosophy. The story of Prometheus tells us that information may be freely given, just as fire was, and it's important to be taught how to use it. And if disaster falls, it is because the people have forgotten the lessons taught with the passing of information. Apollo and Dionysus represent the logic-emotion dichotomy. It is not about choices, it's about consequences. The oracle gives guidelines, not answers, and this is why we tell stories. When the king consults the oracle about the Persian incursion, he asks, should I attack first? The oracle says, if you cross the river, a great kingdom will fall. If she had told the king that his victory is assured, what would he have sacrificed with that knowledge? When he is forced to contemplate it, if it is his great kingdom that will fall, he considers that perhaps war is not the only way to solve the conflict. It was so incredible to experience the legacies in the lessons that were being taught to tourists and locals who walk across these sites, and the knowledge of our tour guides to have this story at this very moment and to teach these lessons once again while we're traveling through the ruins of the site that had created them was an absolutely inexplicable, unexplainable experience. So the Museum at Delphi in particular held an incredible number of artifacts that very much help embed this conceptualized animal-human distinction, or lack thereof, in my thinking about the gods in Greek mythic material. There was a dichotomy present, one that very much surprised me, in which Apollo, who was representing that logic and intellect, was valued and honored, but contrasted with Dionysus, very much receiving the same sort of honor in these ritual processes. And as he represented those emotions and the passion that is involved, both played a role in the rites that were being performed here. The mythical material, as you see in this video that was supposed to keep looping, but apparently is not going to be cooperative for me today, that's fine. It very much heightened this divine association with the location. The theatre frieze, which you see here, captured on the slide here, shows scenes from the Labors of Heracles. And this is this constant mythic motif that is involved in that sort of decoration of the theatre itself. Here we go. So in the week that I spent in Athens, I discovered an interaction between ancient and modern that I had not encountered before. They exist concurrently in and around each other, and there is this working discourse between them that I hadn't anticipated before. And as an Australian classics student, my experience was distance between my context and the classical material that I had studied. So even seeing traveling museum exhibitions, there's space between myself and the ancient world. Whether that space be this conceptual, not quite understanding as artifacts are taken out of their context, or potentially this actual physical different distance that's just not existent in physical places in Greece. On my second day settling into Athens, I wandered into a shop on the Plaka and found a giant perspex case in one of the back rooms, which was covering an entire section of ruins beneath the floor. The shop assistant had put clothing on top of the perspex case because it was right in the middle of the back room of her shop. It was just such an incredible experience to see them interacting so easily. And I saw signs of the ancient world while I was wandering the streets, either in the form of this tourist-type decorations, this absolute acknowledgement that for a lot of tourists coming in and seeing Greece, these ancient motifs are the thing that they hold on to, the thing that they expect, or preserved historical structures like this church, which had seen these iterations through and through again, this Church of Mary, that held those ancient Greek associations by virtue of its location. I also had the opportunity to see a fantastic play, one that is performed pretty consistently throughout the seasons, called Medea and Other Friends I Made in Athens. And if you are ever in Athens, I do encourage you to go and see this play. It is fantastic. It involved a selection of plays, each short sections from the original work, woven into a full-length performance on the rooftop of a university building. The Acropolis was lit in the background, as you can see the photo that I took. I can't explain what it's like to see Greek plays performed with that as your backdrop. So I watched these modern Greek actors adapt the ancient works for an audience of many different nationalities. And it was very much a tourist approach, sort of, that they were taking in the presentation of these texts. The show gave life to the ancient texts in exactly the context that they would have been performed in the ancient world. And there are many things that I was grateful to have had the opportunity to see in Greece, but to watch these plays performed the way that they were supposed to be for the audience itself. I took so many videos of these and thanked the people who were performing for bringing life to this sort of very relevant texts as I had been taught to teach them, potentially to an audience who hadn't seen them before. And it just made me feel so much better about my research area, about teaching students this sort of material, because I'd seen it in action once again. So there are lots of things that I'm grateful for having been able to see. But the very specific part of this trip that changed my thinking about my research, both specific to my thesis and broader research interests, was this complete overlap of a lot of categories that I had thought were distinct. Human and animal, very much enmeshed in the context of a lot of different archaeological sites and archaeological artifacts that had been discovered. And there was this connection between past and present that I was not anticipating at all. And I think I do find that even when I participated in further travel experiences, there's this understanding in Greece that as the ancient indigenous cultures are not just relevant, but they are treated as the same as contemporary cultures. It's on that same value level in particular. There's this reconciliation of ancient and modern that Australia is just very much missing. So the way in which ancient history in Greece is embedded, it's just completely an unexpected joy and a very emotional experience, as I've probably proven in the process of this seminar paper. And my time in Greece was an opportunity that I am incredibly grateful to have experienced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I open up the floor for questions and comments. Effie.
Thank you so much, Tanika. That your talk made me very happy for obvious reasons. My question is less about Greece, although I have understood that awe. I've understood the sort of it's part of us. That history is part of us. Anyway, that's not what my question is about. My question is about the place of the place in your historical writings. In the past, I write about war history, and in the past, I've been told you're really not going to understand the war until you go there and you go to the actual battlefields. Whereas I've had other people that have said, don't worry, it's just a field, And when I have been on certain locations, I haven't really felt that it's influenced my historical practice. But then at the same time, I don't write about Germany, but when I was in Germany, I remember seeing these, huge dips in the ground where you couldn't build homes, and it was because bombs had hit, during the Second World War. Anyway, I wonder how the place being there, whether you could see that it has influenced your historical practice, or if it would have, if you were able to go before COVID. That's my question.
Okay. I spent a long time thinking about this. While I was in Greece, and then later on, so I traveled to Malta afterwards. While I was in Malta especially, I was actually working on my thesis and the last final edits of it. So I can at the very least tell you that I think potentially I would have had a different perspective on the information that I included. So the third chapter of my thesis did involve this Arcadian cult that was housed on Mount Lycaon. And I think I would have had very different things to say about it if I'd been able to travel there. Not just because I would have seen things, I suppose, but maybe because I would have had a better angle on the archaeological processes themselves. So it would have definitely changed my thinking. But I was warned by Marguerite that when I went to Greece, I would discover that being there feels so much less angry and less violent than being in Australia. There's a sense of peace and I think of calm that comes with that. I don't know what it is at all, but experiencing that at the point of my thesis almost being complete, knowing that I didn't need to pressure myself into finding these research avenues and getting the chance to experience more domestic settings than I would have the first time round, I think that changed how I edited the last part of my thesis. I think I was a lot more philosophical than I would have been the first time round. It definitely would have been a different approach that I took. There was one particular, so we went to see the Temple of Poseidon, and we wandered all the way up this hill and we sort of stood right at the top of the hill, had our little wander around, and on the travel back to Athens, the tour guide told the story of Poseidon's seduction of Pasiphae. And the story that I knew was not the one that he was telling the other tour group at all. It was a very watered down and very much kinder alternative to the story. And I thought to myself, I wondered how much my experience with the myths themselves wasn't just affecting how I was viewing it, but how the rest of Greece was viewing me. Like I'd walk into shops and they'd be like, oh, you're a tourist. What are you here for? What do you do for a living? And I'd be like, look, I study here, basically. And I had a lot more embedded information about myths than a lot of the Greek people that I interacted with. Because of course, they were learning their history in schools. They were learning myths as history, as their sort of like base foundational knowledge of their place of origin. So yeah, I think there's just so much that goes into it. And I do understand that, this is really rambly, I apologize. I do understand that it's not necessary to travel everywhere in order to get that good understanding of events or anything like that, because I haven't been to Rome before, and I certainly do research Rome and I understand the sort of like emotional impact, stuff like that. But I also think that in reading about events or places, you're getting a very subjective view of them. It's always going to be the author's approach to the thing itself. And that is the case for all things. And we make do with what we can, especially all the way out here in Australia. But there was something about being there that really turned me into this emotional, philosophical mess for a little while. It's definitely impacted how I thought about my research. I hope that answered your question. I really went on a couple of different angles there.
It definitely did. I know that Nancy's got a hand up. Do you mind if I just say something, Nancy, very short? About the perspective on history that we perhaps don't have here. I had a huge sort of, on one of my visits to Greece, had this big sort of flash of realization when one of my great uncles was talking to me about our mountains. We've lived in our mountains, and, you know, this possessive, using the possessive. And I realized that it's here, but it's just not in the colonial, post-colonial, not at all. Indigenous cultures have that. And of course, Indigenous here is, you know, tens of thousands of years older than Greek culture. Don't say it to any of my family, because they think that Greece is the be all and end all. But it is here. But yeah, the colonial context sort of changes things. Anyway, sorry. Thank you. That was great.
Nancy.
Thanks, Tanika. I really enjoyed listening to your travel tales and how you use them in your academic work. That was great. And of course, when you started talking about human-animal relations, my ears really pricked up, and I thought, okay. So I was so fascinated by the votive offerings that you showed from Olympia, and that discrimination, that distinction that they were feral cattle and horses, etc. And I wonder if maybe I'm digging too deeply into a small point, but what was that about? Do you know? I mean, why were they particularly used as the offering or the sacrifice, the sort of symbolic sacrifice?
I have theories. I definitely don't have any like significant conclusions to draw or anything like that. But one really interesting part of the creation of the figurines themselves was that they could tell some of them were mass produced. So there was very clearly an artisan or some sort of clay worker, metal worker or something like that had set up a shop and was selling these figurines to tourists or people who would come from elsewhere in order to worship at this particular site. And the fact that they were mass produced meant that there was significance to the way in which they were constructed. So I do know for sure there is some real significance in the fact that they are not domesticated, not wild, but that in-between feral representation of the animal itself. There's got to be some ritual that was being performed that had to do with either that, potentially that escape from civilization angle, or maybe even like the sort of like continuation of species even after the removal from that sort of like societal structure or something like that, which is probably what I would go with. But because we don't always have access to the rituals, just the artifacts that they leave behind, we've got to make all of these assumptions about where they go, what they mean, all of that sort of stuff. But it was that mass-produced angle that made sure that those feral characteristics were such an inherent part of the votive offering themselves.
But thinking about it, as you did in the bigger picture about the overlap of categories and the lack of distinction between humans and animals, and those examples you gave of humans presenting as animals in bear skins or being sent to live in the woods as a wolf and so on. It's just a really good reminder, isn't it, that the state that we've been in of this perceived artificial separation between humans and other animals is a very short duration, really, in human history. It's just a blink of the eye. And so maybe that's hopeful for people that are trying to bring back that sense that, you know, we are all kin and we shouldn't have these strict lines between us. Thank you.
Thank you.
I might follow on from that and ask a question. Do you happen to know how they determined that these were feral animals? I mean, I get how you tell between a domestic breed and a wild breed, but how do you tell a statue is of a feral animal?
I did read up on this in preparation for the seminar, and all of the information is gone from my brain. There's a specific source that I was referring back to when I spoke about it in my thesis, that I think came down to historical records of domestic stock. So they weren't seeing the same characteristics, and potentially even a comparison to other artifacts that they had found that they did identify as these are domesticated animals. These don't look quite right. What's going on here? So I think it did come down to that sort of trying to build context around a hypothesis that they'd made. Don't quote me on it. I might have misquoted that academic article that I was referring back to. But yeah, I think it most of the time tends to come from those sort of situations.
Interesting. Other questions?
I have one. Going back to one of your opening statements, actually, which was around the having seen the statues in the replicas on the Erection, and then the originals, or 5 of the 6 originals, are in the Athens Museum, and there's one in the British Museum.
Yes.
And I guess for me, there's a and as we were talking before the seminar, there's a lot of complexity here, because without some of that original material having been taken elsewhere and allowed other people the opportunity to see it and be excited by it and be inspired by it, we probably wouldn't have classical studies in the way that we do, and we wouldn't be able to maintain the interest. So there is a real sort of tension between the desire to see the material in its original place and the opportunity for exposure and learning and thinking that relocation of that material, and in some cases protection, but that's a different argument again. So I just wondered how you balance that in your thinking.
I actually have this conversation with my students a lot. There's a sense that a lot of the assumptions and a lot of the talking around the movement of specific cultural monuments and artifacts, we want to look at it through the lens of this is what should have happened from the start, but this is the system we have, sort of thing. So I can make these grandiose claims and say everything should be given back to exactly where it is, and I know how much more complicated it is than that. And I do think there is definitely a space for stuff like traveling exhibitions in particular, where you do get the opportunity to go and interact with these cultural artifacts and this material culture. And it does give you the opportunity to sort of start those interest levels, to sort of start that more ongoing interaction that you might have. And the traveling, I mean, I know full well it's not an opportunity that is granted to everyone. This is really a very privileged position that I'm in, to have been able to do this to start with. So I know that there's bigger conversations effectively to be had around it, and there is a place for all of it to be held. But that experience of standing in the Acropolis Museum, hearing people talk, and having seen the platform where the last statue would have stood and knowing it was missing, there was this real emotional sense that a part of their history not necessarily was gone from them, because I know there are artifacts in that museum in particular that do experience the travel, but that it wouldn't be given back, which I think was the sticking point for a lot of the conversations, especially. And even now when we're seeing stuff in the news about Venice giving back Parthenon marbles, I think it is. When we're seeing these sort of discussions happen globally, it does really affect the way that you see the artifacts in different places. So I've been teaching my students about the Rosetta Stone, which is currently held at the British Museum and is an Egyptian artifact. And their justification for keeping it there comes down to more people will see it if it's in the British Museum as opposed to moving it to the Cairo Museum. And those justifications fall really flat when it comes down to something that was stolen in the first place, which I think, there's so much to be said about these sort of back and forth about experiencing artifacts in any situation they are. But you do lose a little bit of that context when they're not where they were originally and they're not surrounded by the artifacts that they were created alongside as well. Is that? Yeah. I'm glad.
Other questions? I might ask another one if I may. Sorry, Ian, you had your hand up. You go first.
How's that? Can you hear me? Sorry,
Yep.
not really adept on Zoom. No, great talk. Felt like I was a fly on the wall through it all and took in something of the experience. Just, I guess, technicalities on the Odyssey Scholarship. Were there any particular requirements for your, on completion? And also, I'm not sure that Ryan had re-established connection, but did you make contact with the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens while you were there?
Second question first. I did not. But a lot of what I didn't actually really participate in any academic stuff while I was over there, which was very much on purpose for me. So my supervisor, Marguerite, was suggesting that I link up with a couple of like seminar papers, series and stuff like that. In the end, trying to get everything sorted in about a month time frame was very, very stressful. And so it's just the way that it worked out for trying to set myself up to experience the travel itself while still being a student. There was a really strict timeline that I had to work to, thanks to the fact that it was just interrupted so many times. So I didn't manage to do any of that, like really heavy research or more formalized research while I was there. It was all very just embedded. I'm going to go, I'm going to experience.
It sounds like that had a fair amount of value anyway. I mean, that's, having nearly completed your thesis, it was icing on the cake, yeah, for sure.
No, absolutely. There was a couple of requirements after I got back. I wrote a report about, I think it was a 1,000-word report or so, about my experiences. And this seminar presentation is sort of an extension. I did an informal report to a couple of postgraduate students after I got back, but I think it is preferred that it's a little bit more sort of formalized. So this is effectively part, sort of an ongoing completion of those scholarship requirements. But yeah, effectively all it is aside from the technicalities, they want you to go, they want you to experience, and they want you to get something from it, basically. Which is absolutely what happens, I think, in any way you go about it.
Mission accomplished.
Yes, definitely.
So I was wondering, as historians, we're temporally distanced from our topic, and as ancient historians, that distance is even greater. But there's a kind of spatial distance that you've spoken about a lot, that your trip was a process of overcoming. But I'm wondering whether there's any advantage, in a sense, of going to the place as somebody who's come from Australia, from such a great distance away, in that process of research.
I certainly do think so. I mean, as any classicist in Australia, you have a tendency to be quite displaced from the bulk of the research even, not just the culture itself. So much of the research happens in Europe. And so you really do experience that sense of displacement. I mean, for a while there, I had a lecture series that I was attending, an online lecture series that was being hosted in Amsterdam. So I got up at 2 a.m. every Thursday morning and jumped on Zoom because that's what we do as academics. We want to be there and we want to experience. And so that was my experience in particular. In terms of going and seeing the culture itself as an Australian student, I think it depends entirely on the student in the end. I am firmly of the opinion that no research can be completed objectively. I think I spent 5 years writing a thesis, which was all about my own perception of a topic, and ended up being so much of my opinion and even my identity in those documents in particular. It was why it was so terrifying to submit it and send it off to someone and say, here, judge my entire brain for the last 5 years, please. And so I have that notion of embedded research already in my approach. And so experiencing the culture itself helped me with that emotional connection I felt like I was missing. And it's not the case for everyone's research approach, and it's not the case for everybody who studies texts in particular. I mean, people might already have that emotional connection. They might not necessarily need to travel. But I absolutely do. I put a lot into that emotional connection that you get when you're physically experiencing something that you've been reading about for a really long time.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Then please join me in thanking Tanika for an absolutely fascinating paper. That was really quite wonderful. Before you go, a quick reminder that our final seminar for this semester will be on Friday the 26th of May at our usual time of 10 a.m. Our presenter will be Professor Lyndall Ryan on the topic Frontier Massacres Across Australia, 1794 to 1928, New Approaches to the Study of Australian History. Thank you all, and we hope to see you then.